Hey there, everyone, and welcome to another chapter of Flight Physiology and Human Factors. Here we're looking at Chapter 7, which is going to focus on hearing and noise. And this is coming on the tail end of our discussion from the previous chapter on the eye and vision. And what you're going to see here is that while we agreed in the previous chapter that vision is by far the most important sense that the pilot needs to operate his aircraft safely, hearing is definitely number two. So we're going to take the time we need to understand not only how hearing works, but also how sources of noise affect your ability to operate your aircraft safely. So, our objectives for this chapter are number one, to understand the anatomy and physiology of the ear and be able to describe the step by step process of audition or hearing. Second, we want to be able to identify sources of noise both inside and outside the aircraft and understand how these compromise communication and physiological wellness. And then finally, we want to be able to describe strategies to combat noise in the cockpit and understand the causes and signs of hearing loss. So, like I said at the beginning, in the previous chapter, we discussed how important vision is to flying an airplane, right? So, it's the most critical sense for safe flight operations, whether you're flying IFR or VFR. You need to be able to look at things, right? You need to be able to look outside the aircraft and look for landmarks and look for other potential aircraft for mid-air collisions if you're flying VFR. You need to be able to look at your instruments if you're flying IFR. So regardless of which mode you're flying in, you need to be able to use your eyes. Well, hearing, while maybe not quite as important as vision, hearing is also very important for flying your aircraft because you need to be able to communicate with your flight crew. You need to be able to talk to air traffic control. You need to talk to other pieces of the organizational framework via radio or other methods of communication as well. So it's really going to be important for you to also not only talk to people and communicate with people, but you also need to be able to use your ears to listen for signs of mechanical dysfunction within the aircraft itself, right? So if mechanically something's going wrong, then that very well may be something that you can pick up with your hearing. And then let us not forget, and you know this, anybody who's ever flown in an aircraft knows this before knows this. Flying in an airplane is not a quiet activity. It's a noisy thing, right? So the ambient noise in the cockpit is definitely going to compromise and complicate your ability to communicate, concentrate, and safely pilot your aircraft effectively. So we want to make sure that we take the time to address some of those points as well. So let's talk about the actual physics of sound. So we're not going to get into the nitty gritty of this. I just want to make sure that you have a basic understanding of this. So sound refers to just vibrations of pressure in the air that travel in all directions. So when something makes a sound, it's actually producing vibrations in the air that you can pick up with your ear. So this is actually kind of reminiscent to what we saw in chapter 6 when we talked about light, which we said has both wave and particle properties, and we focused on the wave properties. Well, sound doesn't have particle properties, so we're again just going to be focusing on the wave properties. So the amplitude of these sound waves is going to determine how loud the sound is, similar to how the amplitude of a light wave determines how bright the light is. And then the wavelength and frequency are going to determine the type of sound you are listening to, i.e. the pitch of the sound you are listening to. So the intensity or amplitude of the sound is measured in units of decibels, and the reason why we want to take the time to concern ourselves with amplitude or loudness of the sound is because your ear is a very delicate thing. You don't want to overload it with sound in the same way you don't want to overload the retina of the eye with light, so you can end up with problems in either way. So we'll talk a little bit about the decibel range and in terms of what is too loud for us to really hear, what is too quiet for us to hear. And then the frequency of sound, which is just the inverse of the wavelength, this is measured in units of hertz. So humans can actually only hear a very relatively narrow range of sound frequencies. So we can hear frequencies between 20 hertz and 20,000 hertz. So if you've ever heard of something like a dog whistle, which is something that you blow into and it doesn't make any sound that we can hear, but it drives dogs crazy. Well, that's because dogs have ear setups, and we'll talk about what the inner ear looks like, but their inner ear is set up to hear frequencies that are longer than 20,000 hertz. So there's a reason why dogs can hear a dog whistle and we cannot. So here is a table from your textbook that shows kind of the nature of the logarithmic scale, which is the decibel scale, and it gives you kind of an idea of what certain types of environments are in terms of their loudness level. So you can see that 0 would be the absence of sound. So this is right at the hearing threshold. So you wouldn't really be able to make out any sounds in this range. But if you amp it up to 20 decibels, then this would be the equivalent of kind of a quiet room where you can hear what's going on, but it's definitely not very loud. And then you can see we're ramping up the decibels by 20 to or a little less than that decibels at each step. And what you're going to see here is that obviously the loudness is going to ramp up in intensity, and you'll eventually get to the point where you get into the hundreds of decibels, and this is going to be so loud that it is painful, okay? So eventually you'll get to the point where you end up with decibel levels that are so high that this actually puts the physical integrity of the eardrum at risk. And like I said, this is also a logarithmic scale, so you don't want to make the mistake of thinking that 60 decibels is 3 times louder than 20 decibels, or you don't want to think that 40 decibels is twice as loud as 20 decibels. The rule of thumb is that for every jump up of 10 decibels, that's actually about twice as loud, okay? So that would mean that 40 decibels is about 4 times as loud as 20 decibels rather than 2 times as loud. Okay, so let's take an examination of the human ear. We saw a little bit of this when we looked at chapter 5, which dealt with trapped gases in the middle ear, but we didn't really take much time to talk about the outer ear or the inner ear. So as you can see here, the ear itself can be divided into these 3 compartments, which is the outer ear, the middle ear, and the inner ear. So again, we saw a lot of the middle ear in chapter 5, and we really kind of just focused on the fact that gas gets trapped in there, and that gas can expand when you rise to altitude, and we talked a little bit about the eustachian tubes and the role they play in equalizing air pressure. But again, we're going to focus a little bit more here on all of the ear components and chambers, and we'll focus less on the middle ear, and we'll kind of give the other parts the attention they deserve. So the outer ear, which is mainly going to consist of the ear flap here, which is sometimes called the auditory auricle, and then the external auditory canal. The main function here is to collect incoming sound waves and then funnel them towards the eardrum, okay? So what we're going to see here is that the frequency of the incoming sound is very important, because the fact that we are going to process the incoming auditory information in our brain, we want to preserve the information that is inherent in those sound waves. And the information that tells us what we're listening to is in the frequency. So the frequency is something that we want to maintain, because we're going to want to code that information into an electrical signal that travels to the brain. So the incoming sound waves are going to first strike the tympanic membrane, or the eardrum if you prefer. Okay, so what's going to happen here is when those sound waves strike the eardrum is going to begin vibrating itself. It'll start oscillating back and forth. In fact, it is oscillating back and forth at a frequency that matches the frequency of the incoming sound. So you can kind of see the nature of what we're going to do here. So we have a physical structure that separates the outer and middle ear. It is hit with these incoming sound waves, which have a given frequency, and this physical structure, this tympanic membrane, is going to start vibrating at that same frequency. So again, you can kind of hopefully see what we're going to try to do here. So these vibrations are going to be passed on from structure to structure to structure to structure within the middle and the inner ear. And the goal is that we should maintain the vibration of those oscillations and maintain it so that it's the same as the vibrations in the air, or the frequency of the vibrations in the air that we originally were stimulated with. Okay, so if you look at the at the middle ear here, you can see that the tympanic membrane is attached to this bone here, which is called the malleus. So these bones here, which are called the malleus, incus, and stapes, make up what are called the auditory ossicles. These are the three smallest bones in the entire human body, and they are there to focus on not only amplifying, but transmitting the information in the incoming sound waves. So when the tympanic membrane starts vibrating back and forth, because it is physically attached to the malleus here, the malleus is going to start vibrating at that same frequency. And then because the malleus is attached to the incus will start vibrating at that same frequency. And because the stapes is attached to the incus, you can see where we're going with this, right? So we're basically just playing kind of a game of hot potato, pass the vibration on to the next structure in the line. So when the eardrum starts vibrating at the frequency that matches the sound that came in, it's going to pass those vibrations on to the malleus will pass it on to the incus, and the incus will pass it on to the stapes. So these things are all vibrating one right after another, and they all vibrate with the same frequency as what we originally had coming in through the sound waves. So what after that? So what after the stapes starts vibrating here? Well, the stapes is kind of at the far end of the middle ear. It's almost at the part of the middle ear that is looking into the inner ear. Now, the inner ear consists of several different sensory structures. So you have the cochlea here, which is this kind of snail shell shaped structure. Try saying that 3 times fast. And then you have these kind of loopy things called the semicircular canals. So our focus for now is going to be on the cochlea. So the cochlea is where the sensory structures are that are there for hearing. When we get to chapter 9 on equilibrium, and we start talking about things like the leans, how your body adjusts to being in a controlled bank, and things like that, which is kind of an illusion that you're going to have to deal with when you're flying. When we talk about your body's sense of orientation and rotation about the world around it, we're going to kind of come back to the inner ear, and we're going to start talking about the other part of the inner ear, which consists of the semicircular canals and the vestibular apparatus. But for now, with the topic being hearing, we're just going to focus on this cochlea here. So just bear in mind, we're going to get to those other parts at a later time. Okay, so the stapes right here is attached to this part of the cochlea here called the oval window. So the oval window is kind of a thin membrane that is at the interface between the stapes and the inside of the cochlea. So the reason why this is important is because the sensory cells, these sensitive cells that are going to be what allows us to hear, they are somewhere inside the cochlea. So the cochlea is basically kind of a set of fluid-filled compartments. What you can kind of picture here is that if you take the cochlea and kind of turn it over in your hands, you ought to be able to kind of feel fluid kind of rushing around inside. You can kind of rotate it one way and feel fluid kind of turning with the rotation in your hands and kind of churning around inside. And then you can kind of picture taking the cochlea and turning it the other way and feeling the fluid kind of gushing around inside as well. So this visual is very important because this is going to kind of help you conceptualize what actually happens next. So like I said, the cochlea consists of these fluid-filled cavities. So it's not super important, but these cavities are called the scala tympani, the scala vestibuli, and then the scala media. Again, that's not super important, but that's what they're called. So the more important thing is the cochlea is consisting of these fluid-filled cavities, and what's going to happen when the stapes vibrates and pushes up against that oval window is that oval window is going to get compressed inward, and then it's going to kind of jut back out, and it's going to kind of vibrate and oscillate just like what we've seen before with the eardrum and the auditory ossicles. So what this is going to cause is, because there's fluid on the other side of that oval window, when that oval window picks up the vibrations and compresses inward, that's going to compress that fluid that's inside the cochlea and cause it to vibrate. If you've ever gone to a pond and thrown a rock or a stone into the middle of the water, what happens? Well, you see this kind of ripple effect from the place where the stone breaks the surface of the water. You see these waves kind of radiating outward. That's kind of what's happening here from the the oval window, where it kind of breaks contact with that fluid inside the cochlea. You're going to see kind of this ripple effect. So you're going to see the vibrations, which, by the way, will have the same frequency as the sound that we started with. The vibrations will be transmitted to that cochlear fluid, and that fluid is going to go all around the snail shell of the cochlea, from the origin to the tipsy tip of the cochlea, and you can see the cochlea right there. And what that's going to do, what that oscillating, moving fluid is going to do, is start bending these little bristle-like projections that you see inside the cochlea. So these are microscopic. These are way, way, way too small to actually see without a microscope. But if you look inside the innermost compartment of the cochlea, which is called the scala media, when that fluid starts moving back and forth, the fluid will brush up against these little bristles here, which are called cilia, and that'll cause those cilia to bend back and forth depending on which direction the vibrations are moving. So these little bristles here belong to a type of cell called a hair cell. So these hair cells are the sensory cells that are responsible for hearing. So I'll show you a better picture of those here in just a second. So the bending of the sensory cilia will electrically excite those cells, causing them to transmit electrical impulses through the cochlear branch of what is called the vestibulocochlear nerve. Now this is labeled here as the auditory nerve. The more proper term is the cochlear nerve. So this is what's called the cochlear nerve, and then over here is what's called the vestibular nerve. And together, they eventually wind together to form one single cranial nerve called the vestibulocochlear nerve. So the idea here is that when that fluid starts moving around inside the cochlea and starts bending the bristles of those hair cells, that's going to get those cells excited, and they will eventually send those electrical impulses through the vestibulocochlear nerve, and that will eventually get to the auditory cortex of our brain, and that's going to be how we interpret the things that we are hearing and how we process that information. Very similar to what we saw for vision, except with vision, we had a different nerve, which was the optic nerve, and a different part of the brain which processes it. So that nerve is going to connect to the thalamus in the brain, which again is a sensory relay center, and that will then connect that signal to the auditory cortex in the temporal lobe. Again, that's a little different than what we saw with vision. Okay, so here you can actually see a schematic of one of these hair cells. So you can actually see you have an entire cell here. It's got a nucleus right there, and these are the cilia that we were talking about. The cilia are called stereocilia, with the exception of the tallest one, which is called the kinocilium. So again, it's the bending of these stereocilia that electrically excites the hair cell. And the way that actually works is that when those cilia bend, that actually causes potassium, which is electrically charged, to enter into the body of that hair cell, and that electrically excites the cell and gets it to the point where it wants to send an electrical message down through this nerve fiber right here through the vestibulocochlear nerve and into the brain. Okay, so just real quick, so I'll have more to say about hearing loss towards the end of the chapter, but as long as we're talking about the stereocilia here, I wanted to have just a little bit of something to say about hearing loss. So anything that affects the transmission of these sound vibrations to the organs of Corti, which is kind of the structure that you find in the cochlea that has these hair cells, anything that you can do to affect the transmission of sound vibrations to the organs of Corti can cause hearing loss. So, to that end, there are two different types of hearing loss. There's what is called conductive hearing loss, which has to do with the treatment of the sound vibrations. So, that might be a ruptured eardrum, it might be a problem with the auditory ossicles. But then you also have what's called sensorineural hearing loss, which indicates that the problem is actually has to do with the nervous system. So it's not so much that you're having trouble with your eardrum or your auditory ossicles. It indicates there's a cellular issue that causes maybe those hair cells to not get excited, or maybe there's a problem with your vestibulocochlear nerve. So to that end, if you look at the picture here, you can actually see a case of sensorineural hearing loss in which those stereocilia, which should be all kind of neatly lined up in a row, they've all kind of been bent back and forth. And what can sometimes happen with something like that is extreme and prolonged exposure to very loud sounds can sometimes cause those stereocilia to kind of get out of sorts. So some other examples of things that can cause hearing loss would be ruptured eardrums. That would be a conductive hearing loss problem. And then hair cell damage and vestibulocochlear nerve damage would be sensorineural hearing loss. Okay, so let's switch gears for just a second. Let's talk about sources of noise in flight. So at this point, you should have a pretty good handle on how hearing works. So again, I said, it's not a surprise to find out that flying an airplane is kind of a noisy activity, right? Well, it turns out that most noise comes from outside the airplane. So what you're seeing in this picture here are sources of what is called airframe noise. Now, it's obvious that the engines are definitely going to make noise, but what your textbook says, and it's kind of obvious, is that the engines are really only going to be very, very, very noisy when they're at full throttle. So that's going to be definitely during takeoff, right? So when the engines aren't really at full throttle or full thrust, then they're not going to be quite as noisy, and you're going to experience a lot less engine noise and a lot more airframe noise. So airframe noise has to do with the way that the fuselage of the airplane interacts with the air that is around it. So you probably at this point have some knowledge of aerodynamics and how wings generate lift and things like that. And that's not my area, so it's not really my place to talk to you about that. But when a gigantic an aircraft is flying through the air, it's going to be a little bit noisy. If you've ever heard kind of things whistling as they move through the air, the displacement of air that comes from the airplane moving through it at very high speeds is definitely going to produce some noise. So you can see kind of some examples here, kind of the air interacting with the landing gear, which shouldn't really be that much of an issue if you're at cruising altitude. How the air kind of interacts with not only the flaps and the slats, which will probably be kind of more of an issue in your takeoff or in your kind of initial climb to altitude or your initial descent. And then you've also got inflow turbulence and then wake vortices. So just lots of different ways that the air around the airplane can interact with different parts of the airframe itself. So the conclusion here, regardless, is that as the airplane moves through the air and as it moves in general, there's going to be noise, whether that noise comes from the engine or from the airplane itself. So for now, let's focus on airframe noise. The amount of airframe noise you actually get is a function of dynamic air pressure, which is a determinant of indicated airspeed. So if you didn't know this, then the airspeed that is indicated on your instruments is actually not, strictly speaking, your true airspeed. So your indicated airspeed is a product of not only your true airspeed, but also the air pressure around you. So that's definitely something to be aware of. So in this formula here, where the dynamic air pressure is equal to half the Greek letter rho, which is your air density, times the true airspeed squared, what this basically tells you is that the greatest amount of airframe noise you're going to get because of you're either traveling very fast or you're traveling at very low altitudes where the air density is higher. So basically, the higher you get in the atmosphere and the slower you go, the quieter flight should be. And then the faster you go and the lower you are, the noisier the air travel will be. So here's a diagram that just kind of shows you how noisy different parts of your flight operation are based on the phase of flight. So again, it shouldn't really be a surprise that the noisiest phase of flight is going to be takeoff because of the great amount of engine throttle and air take that is involved. So you can kind of see this is broken down by different types of aircraft. General aviation, kind of your passenger travel, so kind of your commercial jets. And then rotary wing, we're really talking about helicopters, right? So definitely kind of a different category of aircraft. So we don't necessarily have to pay too much attention to that, but you can see rotary wing aircraft kind of have a more consistent noise profile across all different parts of their operations, but on average, helicopters tend to absolutely be the noisiest. A little bit over general aviation, which general aviation planes aren't really built with noise in mind or noise insulation or dampening of noise in mind. But if you look at your commercial jets, then you're going to see that definitely the noisiest part of the flight is the takeoff. And then once you get up to cruising altitude, things actually don't get quite as noisy, although this graph is a little bit misleading because the bottom of the graph is not 0 decibels. The bottom of the graph is 80 decibels, which is still pretty loud. It's still pretty noisy, right? So I don't want you to look at this and think that, oh, well, like when you get to cruising altitude, it's really, really quiet. No, it's not quiet. It's just quieter compared to what you get with takeoff. So like I mentioned, aircraft are generally not designed with sound insulation or sound dampening in mind. So a lot of effort over the years has really been geared at reducing engine noise. So if we can reduce engine noise, then really all that's going to be left after we kind of do that to the best of our ability is going to be airframe noise. Okay, so let's talk about noise and what that does to our ability to communicate in flight. So you can definitely use things like written communication and body language when you're on the flight deck, but the vast majority of communication needs to be done verbally. It's the most efficient way of doing things, right? So external noise from the engine and the airframe can definitely inhibit effective verbal communication, both with your flight crew that are there with you and then via the radio, whether you're talking to air traffic control or someone else. So the FAA estimates that flight deck noise levels above 88 decibels will hamper voice communication. So if we go back to this slide right here, then you can see that during cruising altitude, you're kind of at about 82, 83 decibels, so you're below that 88 threshold, but you can definitely see that there are components of the flight operations in which you get above that 88 decibel limit, especially during takeoff and descent. So we need to make sure that we are being cognizant of communicating effectively when the noise is above that 88 decibel threshold. So again, that 88 decibel threshold, anything above that will hamper voice communication or can potentially do so. So with multiple sound sources, the loudest is going to be the one that's most easily perceived. So the idea here is that, number one, if you have two different sounds in a room and you have established that one is more important than the other, you want the more important one to be the louder one, right? Because that's going to be the one that you notice. The other one will kind of be masked a little bit. It won't be completely ignored. It's still going to be in the background. It's still going to be distracting, but you're not going to notice it as much. So the loudest sound is going to be the one that's most easily perceived, while the others will have the potential to be masked. That sounds kind of obvious, but we want to make sure that we're taking such an obvious statement and framing it in the right context so that we can make the right conclusions here. Okay, so let's say that you're in your flight operations. It's about 82 decibels on the flight deck, not horrendously loud, but still pretty loud. So let's say that you're talking to someone, you're the captain and you're talking to your first officer. Well, when you're talking, you want to understand kind of how different parts of verbal speech work. So consonants, which are non-vowels, right? So you're talking like B, C, D, F, G, and things like that. So anything that's not A, E, I, O, U, or sometimes Y. So consonants are verbalized at lower frequencies and intensities than vowels. We tend to really enunciate and emphasize our vowels, and the consonants kind of go by the wayside. So when noise levels are very high, these consonants have the tendency to kind of be masked or misinterpreted, right? So you might mistake a B for an M, okay? So another thing for us to consider is what's called the signal to noise ratio. This is a measure of the intensity of speech to background noise, and it's going to help us determine the intelligibility of speech in flight. So if we have the knowledge that consonants have the tendency to get misinterpreted because they get emitted at lower frequencies, then we want to make sure that our signal to noise ratio is very good, which we can either do by really going out of our way to talk clearly and loudly and enunciate, or do something to reduce the noise. So we just want to make sure the signal is as high as possible and the noise is as low as possible. Okay, so the good news about misinterpreting consonants, or maybe you're talking to someone on the flight deck and you're not getting 100% of what they're saying, you're not hearing 100% of what they're saying. The good news is that the brain is really pretty good at filling in kind of missed syllables here and there, because we have the experience of hearing the English language all throughout our lives, and we've heard basically every iteration of every kind of phrase we've ever heard before. So we're actually pretty good at filling in gaps. So if you look at this picture that I found from online, you can actually look, like if you actually look at this paragraph very closely, you can see that pretty much every word is horrendously misspelled. But the fact that these words are misspelled should not affect your ability to read it and comprehend what's being said. So what's being said here is obviously the phenomenal power of the human mind. According to research at Cambridge University, it doesn't matter in what order the letters in a word are. The only important thing is that the first and last letter be in the right place. The rest can be a total mess and you can still read it without a problem. This is because the human mind does not read every letter by itself, but the word as a whole. So speech works the same way. Now, I know this is reading. It's not, reading isn't exactly the same thing as speech, but it works the same way. Our brains work in very much the same way, in that if you hear most of what somebody says, you pretty much heard all of what they have to say. So missing a syllable here and there is really not that big a deal, but all the same, we want to make sure that we are maximizing our signal to noise ratio as much as we possibly can. Something we can actually do to help with this is the use of abbreviations, so codes, right? So things like back taxi and over and Roger and squawk and Wilco and things like that. So abbreviated messages that happen very frequently and are subject to not being misinterpreted or masked quite as much can be very helpful. So we can use these abbreviations to signify very specific meanings that everybody with training knows about. So these can actually be very effective at conveying important information when noise levels happen to be very high. So these are the sorts of things that are unlikely to be misinterpreted. And you can see that most of these actually have a great number of vowels in them and not really that many consonants. So that helps with that as well. Okay, so just a little bit more on hearing loss. We mentioned that any physiological impairment of the audition process, whether it's conductive or sensorineural, will manifest itself as a drop in the ability to hear. So pilots who are exposed to high noise levels of flight are at higher risk of NIHL, or noise-induced hearing loss. So if you've ever been to a loud concert, you know exactly what this noise-induced hearing loss is. But thankfully for you, that NIHL that you experienced was likely only temporary. So there are several types of NIHL that we are going to look at here, and we will relate each back to the anatomy and physiology of the ear that we talked about earlier to make sure that we understand the source of the hearing loss. So I mentioned conductive hearing loss. So this type arises out of issues with the outer and middle ear. So we're talking about the transmission and picking up of sound vibrations. So conductive refers to the collection and transmission of sound vibrations, like I just said, through the auditory canal to the eardrum and to the auditory ossicles. Any further than that, you get into the inner ear and you're talking about sensorineural hearing loss. So for conductive hearing loss, most commonly this is going to come either with middle ear infections, ruptured eardrums, calcium deposits on the auditory ossicles. Typically, conductive hearing loss can be pretty easily treated. It's not usually something that's going to have any ill effects for a long amount of time. In Chapter 5, we kind of talked about the middle ear with regard to the equalization of air pressure through the eustachian tubes. So an inability to equalize these pressures can temporarily deform the eardrum, which can lead to an impaired ability to transmit vibrational information to the cochlea in the short term. So we talked a little bit about that in Chapter 5. Well, that's conductive hearing loss, okay? And we also briefly mentioned what's called oxygen ear, which happens following breathing in 100% oxygen. Some of that oxygen will actually get absorbed into the middle ear, and then when you change altitudes, that oxygen can expand, and that can create some discomfort and do the same sort of distorting effect to the eardrum as well. So we talked about strategies for fixing these issues back in Chapter 5. Mostly we talked about the Valsalva maneuver for kind of forcibly equalizing those air pressures between the middle ear and the outside of the eustachian tube. So I also mentioned the sensorineural hearing loss. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about that because we talked about it earlier, and sensorineural hearing loss has much more complicated and much more grim outlooks in terms of actually treating it. Okay, so let's move on to auditory fatigue. So auditory fatigue involves a temporary hearing loss due to overexposure to excessive noise. So the hair cells are overstimulated and temporarily are diminished in their ability to get electrically excited. In other words, they can't really import potassium to get electrically excited. So again, this is an example of that sensorineural hearing loss that I mentioned before, but more temporary. So what this is going to do is raise the decibel threshold of what is considered the minimum for being able to hear something. And sometimes this is accompanied by a ringing in the ears, which is called tinnitus. So this kind of auditory fatigue is kind of what you would get if you spend too much time in an airplane or if you go to a loud rock concert. Now for permanent hearing loss and then also age-related hearing loss, which is called presbycusis, kind of a hard word to say, NIHL can become permanent if the hair cells are not given time to recover by avoiding excessive noise. Now, if you go to a loud rock concert one night, that's probably not going to give you permanent hearing loss, but if you go every night for a month, that's probably not a good thing, right? So high-frequency sounds are going to be those affected first. So a person that's afflicted with permanent NIHL, that doesn't necessarily mean they're deaf and can't hear anything at all. It just means you've for the long term, taken away their ability to hear the highest frequency noises. So over time, those frequencies can kind of come down in frequency. You start by losing the high frequency, and then over time, you start losing the lower frequencies as well. So someone who has just been afflicted with high frequency NIHL may still be able to hear speaking well enough, but that may not be true later on down the line. And then the severity of NIHL and this hearing loss is going to be a function of not only sound intensity, but exposure time, which is pretty obvious, but you can kind of look at this table here and see, okay, time to reach 100% noise dose. If the noise level is 85 decibels, which is kind of typical for what you would find on the flight deck, then your time to reach 100% noise dose, that's about 8 hours, which isn't really a problem if your flight is less than 8 hours, but we know some flights are longer than 8 hours. So The pilots in those cases may want to wear noise dampening headphones, which we'll talk a little bit about later. But you can actually see here that it really doesn't take much of a ramp up in decibel intensity for your time to reach that 100% dose to exponentially decrease. So just by ramping up the decibel intensity by 3 decibels, you lose 4 hours in your dose response here. And then if you get to 100 decibels, you can really only be exposed to 100 decibels for about 15 minutes at a time before it really starts affecting your hearing. Okay, so we're getting pretty close to the end here, so let's talk a little bit about noise and just general fatigue, not necessarily just auditory fatigue. So with general fatigue, we're really just talking about kind of a general feeling of tiredness or malaise for the pilot, kind of just feeling tired. So constant noise makes it really hard to relax your muscles. So the muscles in your face, the muscles in your arm, the muscles in your legs. So just this constant surrounding of noise makes it really hard to relax. So with the constant presence of engine and airframe noise, there's going to be multiple muscle groups in the pilot's body that are just in a constant state of contraction. They're just constantly kind of tense and excited. Well, the problem with that, and we can kind of relate this back to what we saw in chapter 4, I think it was, muscle contraction is an activity that for the muscle cells requires a lot of energy. Keeping your muscles contracted requires a ton of energy. And what we learned in chapter 4 is that in order for your cells to make as much energy as possible, they need oxygen, okay? So to keep those muscles in your face and in your arms and in your legs contracted, those cells need oxygen. So to get those cells their oxygen that they need to stay contracted, this actually takes away resources for the brain and other parts of the body. So if your brain is now getting kind of less oxygen than it otherwise would have, this is going to do things like compromise your alertness and compromise your cognitive function. It's going to make you tired. It's going to make you less good at noticing the things around you and making decisions. So this is another very good reason to make sure that we minimize noise to the greatest extent we possibly can. So speaking of minimizing noises, let's talk about ways that we can actually do that. So some aircraft are equipped with what are called active noise reduction systems, or ANR systems. So these involve microphones that will actually analyze the noise frequencies that are ambient to the aircraft, and then they actually have speakers that will produce sounds of similar intensities but opposite frequencies. So this is what's called noise and anti-noise. So when you get two different frequencies of sound combining together, the amplitudes will sum up together, but the problem with that is that they have the potential of canceling each other out. Let me show you what I mean. So in physics, this is called constructive interference and destructive interference. So consider that you have two different types of waves that are interacting together. On the left here, you have two identical types of waves that have identical amplitudes and frequencies. Because the frequencies are identical, and you can see that the tops of these waves line up together, then you basically add these together. You basically take the height of these waves and add it onto the height of these waves. So you get a combined wave that has basically double the amplitude, but still the same frequency. Well, with destructive interference, here we have two types of waves that are interacting together. They have the same amplitude, but they are actually out of phase with one another, where the top of this wave is actually corresponding with the bottom of this wave, and the top of this wave is corresponding with the bottom of this wave. So when you add those together, it's like adding a positive number to a negative number, and you have the possibility of ending up with just 0. So if you take positive 5 and add that to negative 5, you get the number 0. So that is, in essence, what we're trying to do with noise cancellation. It analyzes the incoming noise and the frequency of that noise and tries to produce a similar noise that is out of phase with it so that those two types of sound vibrations cancel each other out. Okay, so let's talk about hearing protection. So you generally have two major options. You can either use earplugs or you can use headphones. So if you choose to use earplugs, these are actually fairly challenging to work with and use effectively if you don't really know what you're doing. So I'll tell you just a quick little story. Several months ago, I had a buddy and I that were going to go hunting, and I've never been hunting. I'm not much of an outdoorsman. So a mutual friend of ours decided to take us to the rifle range to get some practice, make sure we know how to hold the gun properly and make sure we know what we're doing when we're shooting it. And my buddy had brought along some earplugs. And I was like, oh, great. Well, this will be good for hearing protection. Well, I'd never really used earplugs before, so I didn't really put it in my ear properly. The first time somebody fired their rifle, oh my goodness, my ear hurt so much. And I know now that it's because I didn't put the earplugs in properly. So what you're supposed to do is that the earplugs are malleable and they're supposed to be compressed so that they can fit entirely into the auditory canal. And then you actually have to make sure that you are taking the time and doing the right things to make sure that you give those earplugs a chance to fill up and expand to fill the canal to make sure that it is blocking any incoming noise. So these earplugs block out mid to high frequency noises, which you might think wearing earplugs would actually hamper communication, but because most verbal communication happens with low frequency noises, this will actually enhance verbal communication. It'll actually make it easier to talk to other people because it's blocking out the noises that don't really correspond to human speech. Okay, so that's it for this chapter. I hope you enjoyed yourself. I hope you learned a lot. Join us next time and we will talk about chapter 8, which is going to talk about acceleration and its effects on the body. So basically, we'll be talking about G-forces in flight. So I hope you'll look forward to that, and I will see you next time. So long.